Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be making our Texas Roadhouse rolls. So like I mentioned in class, this recipe is broken out into day 1, day 2, and day 3 if you'd like to make it in 3 days, but you could technically make this recipe in 1 day or even in 2 days if you want to. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how to start this first part of this recipe. As we mentioned, we have 1 1/4 teaspoons of yeast, 1/2 cup plus 2 tablespoons of milk, 2 tablespoons of honey, 3 tablespoons of butter, and you really need to make sure to note that you're going to have 2 tablespoons mixing into the dough, and the other tablespoon is going to be brushed on later. 1/2 of a large egg, 1/2 teaspoon of kosher salt, and 2 cups of flour. And for those of you that picked up ingredients at the high school, as a reminder, we've measured out more than just the 2 cups of flour for you, so you need to make sure that you're really measuring all of these ingredients yourself, okay? So right off the bat, on day 1, or this first part, we are going to use a microwave to heat milk in a glass bowl until it reaches a warm temperature, roughly 110 degrees, okay? When you're making yeast doughs and yeast spreads, the very first thing you have to do is activate your yeast. So like I mentioned in class, yeast is a living thing, okay? Yeast is alive. And so in order for it to actually create that carbon dioxide, to create the gas that you need in order for your bread to rise, you have to wake it up. Right now, a lot of us tend to buy yeast in dry form. So I like to use yeast a lot. I like to make cinnamon rolls and pizza dough and all sorts of things. So I buy yeast in bulk. A lot of you probably are very familiar with buying little packages of yeast. That's what a lot of people tend to buy because they just buy small quantities at a time. I like to, as I mentioned, buy a lot of it at once because I tend to use a lot of it rather than just buying the individual packages. So for your yeast, it typically comes in this dry format. There are other versions of yeast out there, but a lot of what we're going to be using is just this dry format here. Okay, so your dried yeast right now, if you think back to that video we watched in class, your little yeast monsters are sleeping, okay? It's just dry, it's dormant. They're sleeping right now. So in order to wake them up, we need to put them in some sort of warm liquid, such as water or warm milk, and then provide them with something to eat, some sort of sugar, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I've went ahead and I measured out the 1/2 cup plus 2 tablespoons of milk into a little glass container here, and I'm going to heat it up in the microwave. I'm going to start off by putting my milk in the microwave for about a minute, and then I'm going to test it and go from there, okay? So I'll be right back. I'm going to put this in the microwave and start to heat it up, okay? I don't want to put this on for a really long time in the microwave, like 5 or 6 minutes, because I don't want to scald my milk. If I put my milk in the microwave for like a really long time, it's gonna burn my milk, okay? And it's gonna give my rolls an off flavor, and it's just gonna kill my yeast because it's gonna be way too hot. So I'm gonna go ahead, like I said, put this in the microwave, and I'll be right back. Okay, I am back. So on your recipe, it says that you wanna heat your milk up until it reaches a warm temperature, roughly 110 degrees. If you have a meat thermometer at home, like I do, you are more than welcome to measure the actual temperature of your milk with the meat thermometer. To use a meat thermometer like this, what you'll do is you want to make sure you're not touching the actual stem of the thermometer. If you touch the stem of the thermometer, that's going to affect the reading of the temperature. But you want to put it in your milk where it's not touching the bottom, it's just kind of floating in there. And you want to wait until the gauge reads about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, that's about how hot you want it. Right now, hey, you're in the way. Right now, mine's kind of moving slowly. You can see here. I can get close. You can see it's slowly reaching about the 100 mark. Okay, got a little bit of steam, not too much. So I microwave mine for about a minute, okay? And I wanted to get mine as close to 110 as possible. If you do not have a meat thermometer, that's okay. If you do not have a meat thermometer, that's okay. A good general rule of thumb is that you want your milk or your water warm enough that you can still put your finger in it, but at the same time it's not burning you, okay? So mine's pretty warm. I have it pretty hot. So you wanna make sure it gets pretty warm. You want it fairly warm. If you have it just kind of like room temperature or lukewarm, not very hot at all, your yeast is not gonna activate. So you wanna make sure that it's fairly warm. Warm enough that you don't feel like you're gonna burn yourself when you put your finger in it, but still not so cold that it's not hot at all, okay? So once my milk is warmed, I'm gonna add my yeast and my honey in a small bowl. So I need, 1 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. So I'm gonna find my 1, and then my 1/4 here. Okay. All right, and then like I said, our yeast needs something to eat. It needs sugar, right? Well, instead of using our granulated or our white sugar, we're gonna be using honey, okay? Honey is a natural sweetener. Honey's got a lot of sugar in it. So we're gonna use 2 tablespoons of honey in here. Okay, and I actually have a measuring cup that's exactly 2 tablespoons that I'm gonna go ahead and use to measure out my honey. And I'm probably gonna have to wash my hands here in just a second again, because honey is very, very sticky. Okay. So once I've added my honey, I'm gonna agitate my yeast, or I'm gonna mix my yeast together in the milk and with my honey. If you do not have milk at home, you are more than welcome to use water instead of milk. Hot water will work just as well for this. Warm water will work just as well. But if you want these very similar to your Texas Roadhouse rolls, you'll want to use milk. Milk makes a more tender roll. Okay, makes your bread a lot more tender. Gluten forms a little bit differently when you add milk instead of just water. There's not as much gluten that forms. Makes shorter strands, and so it's nice and tender. Okay. So once I've added my milk and honey, I'm gonna go ahead and combine it. And then I'm gonna go ahead and leave my yeast alone once I've got this all combined. Okay, got my yeast in here, I got my milk in here, I got my honey in here. And then I'm gonna let it set. Okay. As you can see, I have a few little bubbles already forming here. Right now, I've got a few little bubbles forming. But I wanted to let it set for at least 5 minutes. That way my yeast really activates and really comes alive, okay? And the way you can tell that is that I'll have a nice thin foam kind of at the top right here in my bowl, okay? That's why it's really a really good idea to have a clear bowl if possible whenever you're doing this, having like a clear plastic bowl or a clear glass bowl. You'll be able to tell the yeast is activated because it'll look nice and frothy, and you'll see that there's a bunch of little like kind of bubbles of carbon dioxide that the yeast has created at the top. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna wash my hands, and I'm gonna let my yeast activate. So my yeast is still activating. I'll go ahead and show you guys what it looks like right now. As you can see, it's starting to get nice and frothy, and you kind of can see some of those little darker air bubbles there. If I move it over a little bit, I'm trying not to move it too much, you can start to see a thin layer here forming. Might be a little challenging in this light. I apologize, guys. I'm gonna let that sit for just a little bit longer, and while I'm letting that sit, I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the next step, okay? But it's starting to get activated. Goodness. Okay, while this is still fermenting, when I talk about my yeast activating, remember when we mentioned that fermentation process in class? That's what's going on right now, okay? So the yeast at the moment is going through, and it's starting to slowly wake up, and it's starting to eat those sugars, and it's turning those sugars and a carbon dioxide and alcohol, okay? So that's why it might kind of smell a little bit like beer. If you smell it, it smells a little bit like that. But that carbon dioxide, that's what makes your bread rise, okay? That's what you're looking for. So we've got a little bit we're gonna lose right here, but as we add it to our flour mixture and start forming that dough, that yeast is gonna continue to ferment, and it's gonna continue to eat the sugar, and it's gonna start making carbon dioxide, and it's gonna get trapped in those gluten strands in the bread that you're gonna be making, okay? So we watched that video in class and talked about that a little bit. So we've got a little bit of that carbon dioxide forming right now, and then more of it's gonna form as we let it set and rise, okay? And let it kind of continue to ferment. So we've got our milk, yeast, and honey in that bowl. We're letting it set still. And a large bowl, we're gonna mix 2 tablespoons of butter. This mixture here in just a minute are half of an egg and 1 cup of flour. So I am gonna be using my standing mixer, okay? I have a lovely little standing mixer here. And then this attachment here is called a dough hook, okay? It is used for mixing dough. There are other types of attachments. There's paddles, there's whisks, and all of them have different uses. This dough hook is used specifically for bread, and it kind of mimics the action of kneading the bread dough. So I am using this dough hook. If you do not have a mixer, that is perfectly fine. You do not have to have a mixer in order to make this recipe. You can make this recipe by hand. My recommendation is to mix your dough with a sturdy rubber spatula or a wooden spoon, okay? That's how I would mix it. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna use my mixer to make my life a little bit easier though. And then at some point in time here towards the end, I will have to take it out and I'll have to finish kneading it by hand. But I'll be able to use this mixer at least for the first part. So I went ahead and as a reminder, I only needed 2 tablespoons of butter. My recipe calls for 3, but I only needed 2 tablespoons of melted butter. Your butter is separated out into tablespoons, okay? There's 8 tablespoons in 1 stick of butter. So I counted 1, 2, and cut just 2 tablespoons off. And I went ahead and melted it in the microwave. Took me about 20 seconds to melt in my microwave. Might take you longer in yours, just depends on how, what your microwave is like. I'm gonna go ahead and get all that in there. So I've got my butter. And it says I'm gonna need half of an egg. So 1 egg is equal to 4 tablespoons. There's 4 tablespoons of liquid in 1 egg. So to measure out half of an egg, you're gonna need to crack an egg into a bowl, okay, like I've done. I am then gonna go ahead and beat it to the best of my ability and try to measure out just 2 tablespoons of it. I don't know if any of you have noticed, but my egg looks a little funky, right? This is actually a double yolked egg. So it's got 2 yolks in it. If this egg would have been fertilized, it would have made twins, basically. We would have had 2 chickens. This is actually my second double yolk that I've cracked today. When I made my chocolate chip cookies earlier for Foods 1, I also had a double yolk that I used for that recipe. So I don't know, that maybe the whole carton is, but I've had 2 so far in a row. So I'm gonna go ahead, and like I said, I'm gonna go ahead and beat this whole egg. I'm gonna use both yolks. I'm not too concerned about having a little extra yolk, just be a little extra protein. And I'm getting to get this as mixed and beaten best I can. We talked about those mixing terms the other day in class. This is what I'm talking about beating. It's when I'm quickly and vigorously mixing everything together and I'm beating that egg so it's nice and combined. So this is what it looks like. Okay, till it's nice and combined. Best of my ability. Okay. Once I get it as combined as I can, I'm gonna do my best to measure out 2 tablespoons. Okay, and it's okay if it's not perfect. If you look right now, it's not quite a full tablespoon. Okay, it's a little tricky to measure out a full tablespoon of egg. So I've got close to a full one here. I'm gonna do my best, like I said, to measure out a second full one. Still not quite full all the way. So I got 2 there, and I'm gonna go ahead and measure just a little extra, just for good measure, just in case. Okay. The rest of this egg that you don't use, you can set aside and scramble it to make eggs for yourself. You can toss it if you want to. I had somebody ask if we could double the recipe, and you're more than welcome to double the recipe and use 1 whole egg instead of half of an egg. But for what we're doing, I'm just using half. So I've got my melted butter, got my egg in here. I'm gonna go ahead and add my yeast now. And I want you to take a look. My yeast definitely looks a lot fluffier now, right? Kind of looks a little pillowy on top. I'm gonna go ahead, move this over a little bit. See if we can get down here. And as you can see, hopefully you can see, there's a little bit of a white line here, okay? That's some of that carbon dioxide that I'm talking about. That's a good way to tell if your yeast is activated is to look for that distinctive white line. Okay, you're gonna look for that white line. You're gonna look for the holes up here at the top that you can see. And like I said, your yeast, it kind of floats on the top there, right? So I've got a nice line here. Hopefully you guys will be able to see that. But I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna add this to my larger bowl. It's my bowl over here. Try to scrape out and get all the yeast in there that I can. The more yeast I have in there, the better my rolls are gonna rise. And then the last thing I need is about a cup of flour. So I need 2 cups in total, but I'm gonna start off with just 1 cup of flour. If I put both cups of flour in here at once, there's a good chance that I'm gonna have flour thrown everywhere and everything's not gonna combine very well. Okay? So I've kind of fluffed my flour a little bit. If you remember from Foods 1, when I'm measuring out my flour, I've kind of aerated a little bit. I'm gonna try to measure a heaping cup. Okay, so sorry, my battery died. As I was saying, measuring out my flour, if you remember from Foods 1, I'm not gonna pack this down. I'm gonna measure out a heaping cup of flour and then take a straight edge and level it off, okay? That way I start off with 1 cup of flour. I'm gonna go ahead and start slowly combining these. All right. So I'm gonna go ahead, like I said, I've got my 2 tablespoons of butter in here. Got my 2 tablespoons of butter in here. I've got my milk, egg, and yeast mixture. I've got 1 cup of flour, and then I'm mixing it nice and slow until it's smooth, okay? If you don't have a dough hook, like I said, you're more than welcome to mix this by hand, okay? Once this kind of gets nice and combined, I'm gonna slowly add in that last cup of flour and my salt, okay? So I need half a teaspoon of salt. So I'm gonna go ahead while I'm thinking about it, add my half a teaspoon of salt, and then get my flour ready to measure out the rest of my flour. It's really important that you wait to add your salt until after you've added a little bit of flour to your mixture, a little bit of flour to your yeast, because salt will actually kill yeast, okay? If you add salt just to your yeast by itself with the milk and the honey, there's a good chance it'll kill your yeast and it won't activate. So you want to make sure to wait and add it after you've added some other ingredients so it doesn't accidentally kill your yeast. I went ahead and added that second cup. let you see here. What used to look like a liquid is starting to kind of come together as a dough now, okay? Slowly starting to look like a dough instead of just a liquidy mess. Now, like I said, this recipe calls for only 2 cups of flour, but there's a good chance you're gonna have to add more than just 2 cups of flour to this recipe, okay? I'm gonna go ahead in here in just a second and scrape down the flour off the edges. But when I start kneading my dough, I'm gonna need more than just the 2 cups, okay? So I'm gonna need a little bit of flour on my countertop so my dough doesn't stick to my counter. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna stop this really quick. Lower it. Scrape down those sides. If your dough is really, really wet and it's not forming into a ball that you can like pick up, it's okay to add a little extra flour, okay? When you're making breads and rolls, bread and rolls and baking in general is very, very particular. Like I said, it's really important that you're measuring all of your ingredients out exactly as they're listed on the recipe. If you don't, there's a good chance your recipe won't turn out. When you're baking, the weather also plays a factor in if your recipe's gonna turn out. If it's really wet outside, so like if it's raining, there's gonna be a lot of moisture, a lot of water in the air. And when you make breads and rolls and things, and there's a lot of water in the air, a lot of times you end up having to use more flour, okay? So the weather really plays a role in your bread when you make it, okay? So I've got this kind of just combined here. What I'm gonna go ahead and do, take my dough hook off, move that a little bit. This looks still pretty sticky to me, so I'm gonna make sure I'm gonna add plenty of extra flour just in case, to make sure it all kind of comes together. But my next step, I'm gonna mix/knead my dough for about 8 minutes and then drop it on a lightly floured surface and knead it for a few more minutes. So to me right here, this still looks really wet. Still looks really, really sticky, okay? So I use 2 cups of flour, but with how sticky this is just gonna be a big mess if I try to pull it out of the bowl right now. So I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit more flour and let it mix for another at least 5 minutes. The recipe says 8. I'm gonna do at least 5 and see kind of where I'm at and go from there, okay? Like I said, if you are mixing this by hand, this is the point in time where you might still be mixing this with your hand, but you might have to, you might be mixing it with a spoon, but you might have to start mixing it by hand. Okay, so I've added, like I said, a little more flour, probably about 1/4 of a cup there. I'm gonna let it continue to mix. Slowly coming a little bit more together now. Okay? Looking a little bit more like a dough. Let it keep kneading. If I wanted to, I could stop for a second and kind of scrape down the sides a little bit, but it looks like that dough hook's getting pretty much everything I want on there. Okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna stop this right here. I'm gonna take this out. And what I've created now is called a shaggy dough. The reason it's called a shaggy dough is because it looks kind of shaggy and disheveled, right? It's not very, goodness. It's not kind of all together. There's still some lumps in it, and it's kind of got some weird different spots to it, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and I am gonna use my countertop here. Use my countertop to finish kneading my dough on. Okay, if you want to use a clean countertop, you can use your clean countertop. If you want to use a cutting board, you can use a cutting board. But I'm gonna go ahead, pull my dough right off my dough hook. Add a small amount of flour to my countertop so my dough doesn't stick. And when I say small, I mean very, very small, okay? I want just a sprinkling on my countertop. I don't want my countertop covered in flour. If my countertop's covered in flour, I'm gonna have way too much flour in my dough. And my biscuits are gonna turn really dry and really tough. Or my rolls are gonna be very dry and very tough, and they're not gonna turn out very well, okay? So, let's set this off to the side. As we talked about in class, to knead your dough, let's see if I can get this turned a little bit. Okay, to knead your dough, I'm gonna use the palm of my hand, okay? I'm gonna push the dough away from me and gently pull it back, and then continually turn it clockwise until it's nice and smooth. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna push gently, pull it back, push, pull it back, and I'm gonna keep doing that. Push and pull till it forms a nice, smooth ball, okay? You wanna make sure that you do this for long enough that you get that gluten formation that you're wanting, but not for too long where you have too much gluten that forms. Okay, we don't want really tough rolls. We want our rolls to be nice and soft. Okay, those of you that have taken art classes before, if you've ever worked with clay, this might remind you of working with clay a little bit. Definitely softer than clay, but it's very, very similar. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna need it a little bit longer. All right, now this is the point. Once you have a nice, smooth ball that is formed, just like this, okay, you'll know that your ball is done, your dough is done, when you can press in it and it springs back, okay? So when you press down, let me see, press in it, it springs back. Can I see a little spring there? Okay. My dough, my yeast is still working in here. My yeast still needs to continue eating that sugar that we gave it, and it needs to continue creating carbon dioxide. And now that I have some lovely gluten strands that have formed, those gluten strands are gonna trap that carbon dioxide so my rolls will rise really well. So what I'm gonna do, I have two options. I can either take my dough and put it in a gallon-sized baggie and put it in the fridge and wait a whole 24 hours to do anything with this, or I can put my ball of dough in a bowl that I've sprayed with nonstick cooking spray and let it set out for about an hour and rise. Okay? This recipe, you're more than welcome to make, like I said, in multiple days. So I can take this and I can put it in a Ziploc baggie and let it set for 24 hours, and my yeast will slowly rise in the refrigerator. So when you come back tomorrow, it'll be double in size. If you want to go ahead and make this all in one day, you can go ahead and put it in a bowl and cover it with a damp towel and let it rise for about an hour or until it doubles in size. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make mine all in one day. So I'm gonna get some nonstick cooking spray and spray this bowl down a little bit. And I'm going to get a towel to put over here. and let it set out for about an hour. The reason I spray my bowl down is because if I don't, as my dough starts to rise, it might stick to the bowl. Okay, so it looks like this. It might stick to the bowl, and then I'm gonna have a really hard time getting it out when it's done. And then, like I said, I like to take, you can take a dry towel, or I like to take a damp towel, so one that I've got a little bit of water on here, that's nice and hot, and set it over my bowl. Okay, yeast likes to be warm. So I like to take a hot towel, like I said, a hot damp towel, and put it over here, because yeast likes things that are warm and things that are moist. So I'm gonna go ahead and let this set for about an hour, and then I'll come back and I'll show you what it looks like when it's doubled in size. Okay, so it's me again. I have the camera kind of tilted down a little bit, that way you can see what I'm actually doing. So you can't see my face, my apologies. You can also see my great big belly right now, probably. It's pretty big at the moment. So, as I mentioned, this is either day 2 or this is about an hour after you've started your dough, okay? So, if you went ahead and followed the directions and put your dough in a gallon-sized bag and removed all the air and then refrigerated it till the next day, you're now on day 2. Okay, this is what you're doing on the second day. If instead you decided to make your rolls all in one day instead of waiting, this is about an hour after you let your dough rise in a bowl. So, I've got my dough right here. I've got my towel that covered it. I'm gonna set this off to the side because I'm gonna use it again later. And I've let my dough rise. And if you can see, if you remember correctly, this is about doubled in size now. Okay, that's pretty large. It's definitely a lot larger than what it was previously. That's because that yeast has eaten all that sugar and has fermented and has created a bunch of carbon dioxide that now the gluten strands have trapped, and so it's now risen. Okay, this is the first time this dough has rose. We're actually going to let this dough rise twice. So the first time we let it rise, while it was in this ball like this, and as you can see when you push down on it, it springs back just a little bit, not quite as much, but we've got a lot of gas trapped in here, and if you actually press on it, it feels a little different. It's definitely not as dense as it was before. It definitely feels a little bit lighter because it's got all that air trapped in it. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to punch this dough down. So what that means is that we're actually going to release some of the gas that's trapped in there. Once we release some of the gas that's trapped in there, that's going to allow for the yeast to go ahead and finish eating the rest of that sugar that's in here and let it produce more gas and rise again. So I'm not going to knead the dough. All I'm going to do is just kind of push it down a little bit, kind of punch it down where it kind of stays a little bit of a ball. I'm not going to do a whole bunch with it. Okay, kind of smushed now. And then, once I've got that punched down, I'm going to take a little bit of flour once again, flour my countertop. And like I said, this is why it's so important that, you're measuring your flour out correctly. Because those of you that picked up ingredients at the high school had more than 2 cups of flour, and that's because you need to flour your surface. Okay, so I've got a little bit of flour here. I'm going to take my dough, put it out, lay it out here on my countertop. I punched it down a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead, make sure it's in that nice ball shape that I'm wanting. And I'm going to roll it out until it is about 1/2 inch thick. Okay? And I'm actually, at this point in time, I'm going to form my rolls. For those of you that have parents or like mothers and grandmothers, somebody that likes to make rolls in your house, they might tell you that they like to pull pieces of the dough off and roll them into individual balls, okay, to make their rolls. and that's perfectly fine. If they want to do that, does not bother me. This recipe, to make them similar to how Texas Roadhouse does, what it recommends is that you roll it out in a circle and then cut them into the shape that you want. Okay, so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna try to roll my dough out a little bit. I don't wanna roll it out too thin. If I roll it out too thin, I'm not gonna have very many rolls. Okay, and they're gonna be really flat. Okay, if you don't have a rolling pin, you are more than welcome to kind of lightly push and pull your dough into the shape that you want it. Okay, I'm trying to keep mine fairly circular here. We want it about 1/2 of an inch thick. If you look at your finger, if you take your pointer finger, this segment of your pointer finger should roughly be about 1 inch thick. So you want your dough to come up to about 1/2 of it. So if you look, hopefully, it's kind of hard to see. Like I said, it should be about halfway up my finger. I am then gonna take a pizza cutter or a knife and cut my dough into my squares. And then I can either cover them in plastic wrap on my baking sheet and put them in the fridge and wait until bake them the next day, or I can go ahead and leave them, kind of cover them up with a towel once again, like I've used previously, let them set for another hour, and then bake them. Okay, so what I'm gonna go ahead and do, I'm gonna cut these the best of my ability. These are gonna be kind of smaller rolls. And I think what I'm gonna do is I might have to form some of them kind of a little bit differently, and that's okay. In order to make them kind of the shape that I want them, I think what I'm gonna do, let's see here. My recommendation is use a slightly sharper knife. The only reason I'm not using a really sharp knife right now is because I don't want to cut my countertop. So I've got my baking sheet, got my rolls. Unlike your cookies, I'm gonna put my rolls fairly close together. I like my rolls kind of like, I tend to like my rolls touching. That way they kind of help each other rise. That's how I typically like to make them. But that's not something that you have to do, and that's okay. And I'm gonna put the smaller ones towards the center. Okay, these kind of straggling pieces here, I'm gonna try to kind of roll a little bit. Make them kind of a shape that I want them. Like I said, I'm gonna put the larger ones towards the outside and the smaller ones towards the inside, because the smaller ones aren't gonna take as long to cook as the larger ones. Okay. All right, so I ended up with about 6, 7, 8 rolls here. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna take my towel again, let them set and rise for about an hour, and then I'm gonna put them in the oven. So before I put them in the oven, I'll show you guys what these look like, and then when I pull them out, I'll show you what they look like again. Okay? All right, so at this point in time, as I've mentioned, instead of covering the tray with plastic wrap and refrigerating it overnight, I went ahead and let my rolls double for about an hour and rise. And I preheated my oven to 350 degrees. Okay, I'm now gonna bake my rolls for about 12 to 15 minutes or until the tops are golden brown. I think I'm probably gonna put my rolls in for about 10 minutes and then check them out because my oven tends to run a little hot. But 12 to 15 is typically what you're wanting. So once I let my rolls bake, I'm then gonna brush that remaining tablespoon of butter on top of my rolls. So remember we started off with 3 tablespoons and we used 2 of them in the recipe. That other tablespoon is going to go on top of my rolls. Okay, so I have my rolls here. And as you can see, they've now doubled in size. Okay, these are much larger than what they were when I originally put them on my tray. Okay, so these are now doubled in size, and you can see they're kind of touching each other a little bit. That's okay. I kind of like my rolls like that. When you cut these out, I'd highly recommend trying to make them roughly the same size if at all possible. As you can see, I've got a couple rolls that are a little bit smaller than the other ones. I should have done a little bit better job of forming them so they're about the same size. That way they cook evenly. I'll just have to watch these rolls over here to make sure they cook the way they're supposed to, okay? So as I'm baking my rolls, I'm gonna go ahead and put these in the oven here. To determine when your rolls are done, they're a little bit different than other baked goods, okay? You're not gonna stick them with a toothpick, okay? We don't want our rolls to deflate, so you're not gonna stick them with a toothpick. What you're gonna do is you're gonna test the tops of them, okay? So as your rolls are cooking, they should turn a nice golden brown color, kind of like what you see at Texas Roadhouse. And actually, I have some examples of what the Texas Roadhouse rolls look like when you actually buy them from there. So give me 1 second, I'll show those to you. Okay. So the Texas Roadhouse rolls should ideally have kind of this nice golden brown color when they're done, right? Okay. I think mine are roughly the same size. I might have let mine rise a little bit longer than they did for these. So mine are actually a little bit fatter than these, and that's okay. I personally, I like really large rolls, so I'm okay with that. But as you can see, your rolls are gonna have this nice golden brown color. And when you touch on the tops, they should feel firm, okay? They should feel firm. When you press on them, your finger should spring back. They should potentially, when you hit them, kind of have a thumping noise to it. And the bottoms might have a little brown spot, okay? Hopefully they're not black. They should just have a little brown spot. So to determine the doneness of your rolls, you're gonna check for the color and the sound. So you wanna see that nice golden brown color, and you wanna hear kind of that thumping sound, okay? They shouldn't sound hollow. Your finger shouldn't stick right through them. So you're gonna go ahead, like I said, I'm gonna let these bake for about 10 minutes, and I'll pull them out and I'll show you what they look like when they're done, okay? Okay, so I went ahead and baked my biscuits for about 12 minutes. I'm gonna go ahead, open up the oven. As you can see, my rolls been on the center rack there. Got a nice golden brown color. And the very last step to make these similar to how you get them at Texas Roadhouse is to go ahead and brush some melted butter on them. So I'm gonna go ahead and, like I said earlier, I'm gonna take some melted butter, and I've got a lovely little pastry brush here, and I'm just gonna melt some butter right on top while they're still hot. And that butter, just kind of sizzle a little bit. Will hopefully kind of start to absorb in those biscuits, or those rolls. I'm so sorry, ladies and gentlemen. And like I said, the way that I know that these are done is because they've got that lovely golden brown color, and then when I tap on them, they kind of have that thumping sound, okay? And when I look at the bottoms, they've got a nice, right there, got that nice golden brown bottom, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna let these cool, and I'm gonna finish putting some of that melted butter, brushing them with that melted butter on there. For me, the more butter, the better. I think that's kind of what really makes these taste so good. But if you have made them correctly, they should not stick to the pan. You do not have to like spray them or do anything to them. Like I said, they should have this nice, lovely golden brown color, and these are good once you let them cool off for just a few minutes to start putting your cinnamon butter on them, okay? So like I said, hopefully yours turn out as well as mine. You are more than welcome to make this recipe all in one day, or go ahead and take the 3 days like the recipe suggests. So that's up to you, okay? But I really hope you guys enjoy.